Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 26, The Hermit Kingdom of Albania. When you think of isolated countries, places that have walled themselves off completely from the outside world, most people's minds immediately go to North Korea. However, during the communist era, in many ways, Albania and the Albanian people were even more isolated than North Korea is today. And despite bordering Greece and being very close to Italy, Albania remains a mystery to many Westerners. My guest today is Allison Green, the travel writer and blogger behind the website Eternal Arrival. Allison and I discuss what Albania was like after independence from the Ottoman Empire, how it came to be a pawn between Hitler and Mussolini, and how its tyrannical dictator managed to wall Albania off from the outside world. My guest today is Allison Green. She's the travel blogger at Eternal Arrival. Allison and I are actually in real life friends. We met when I was in Kosovo last summer, and I was pretty sick of grilled Balkan meat because when you're in the Balkans, you eat a lot of grilled meat. I think I Googled where to find Indian food in Kosovo, and Allison, you had an article on it, and then after that I knew we needed to be friends. So hi.
Hi. Yeah, I remember you mentioned me on Twitter, and I barely log into Twitter these days, and I look at it, and I had a message from you being like, oh, hat tip to Allison Green for her recommendation on Indian food in Kosovo. When did we meet in real life? That would be Bulgaria.
Yeah, like a month later. So I think we exchanged some messages, and I was like, if you're going to be in Sofia, I live there, so let me know if you have any questions. And then you actually happened to be in Sofia like a few weeks later, so that's how we actually met in real life. So because you are also a travel blogger and you are also Balkan lover, we've been to a lot of the same places, but one place that you are more of an expert on than anyone I know is Albania. And before I got to Albania, there were so many things I didn't realize about it. I think from a Western perspective, it's easy for people to look at the Balkans and think, Greece, okay, I know that. Bulgaria is a country, Romania is a country. Everything else is Yugoslavia. Like, everything else was Yugoslavia. And Albania wasn't. And when I realized that, it blew my mind. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of when I fell in love with the country, when you start seeing how it's, like, totally different than everywhere else in the Balkans. And how did you end up falling in love with Albania?
So the reason why I went to Albania is because I actually worked with like a huge number of Albanians at my public school that I used to work at in New York. So the Albanian diaspora is massive. In fact, there are more Albanians living outside of Albania than inside of Albania, which I just find absolutely mind-blowing. There's something like over 3 million Albanians living outside of Albania and just around 3 who live in Albania. Let's fact check that. But there are more Albanians living outside of Albania than inside of it. And so many of my coworkers, they knew I loved to travel, and that every year I'd spend the entire summer traveling as much as I possibly could. They'd always tell me, you have to visit Albania. So one of my last days of work, as I was planning to leave, I was getting recommendations from all of my coworkers on where I should go in Albania. And I think I left with like 7 Post-it notes full of recommendations and places and restaurants, and just basically like a whole guide to the country written on 3 or 4 different Post-it notes. And I just decided to take them up on their advice and go to the places that were recommended to me the most, and just sort of traveled in their footsteps. And I really ended up falling in love with the country so much that after I spent 2 weeks in it, and then I came back like a month later and spent another week in it. So it's just one of those countries that really just kind of grabbed me because it was so unique and so interesting to travel through.
So let's talk about the history of Albania. We're going to focus on the modern history of the country because the further back you go, the further the rest of the Balkan Peninsula kind of looks the same, right? Different groups of people, different ethnic groups of people moving around the country. And then you get the Romans come in and take over everything. And then you get the, maybe they have independent national movements, maybe they don't. And then at a certain point, Turkey comes in and the Ottoman Empire takes over. And it's kind of what happens after the Ottoman Empire in each country that is a unique story.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, before I got to Albania, I thought I was going to be going to the former Yugoslavia. And if you're interested in the history of the former Yugoslavia, there's a whole episode that I did on Belgrade where we covered it. But I think Albania is a really great story to tell because that's the piece that's kind of missing that goes beside Yugoslavia, but is not a part of it. So set the scene. What does Albania look like in the early part of the 20th century?
So in the earlier part of the 20th century, Albania is starting to get nationalist ambitions. In the late 19th century, there were some poets and other writers who were starting to sort of create like an Albanian consciousness, like a nationalism. And at this time, they're still part of the Ottoman Empire, but it is starting to fracture a little bit as different groups within Yugoslavia are getting sort of antsy being under the yoke of the Ottoman Empire, and obviously the Ottoman Empire is close to ending. So by 1910, you start to have some agitations happening. And then by 1912, that's when the first Albanian Republic was created. So after a series of unsuccessful uprisings. So then Albania kind of goes back and forth. It goes from monarchy to republic to monarchy. They're not really sure what they're doing. And then right before World War II, they are occupied by Mussolini's Italy. And so just to put like this into perspective, I never thought of Italy and Albania as being close. I think just because Italy in our minds is so Western and Albania in our minds is so just foreign. Like one of the most Googled questions about Albania is, where is Albania? Keep in mind that Italy and Albania are only about 45 kilometers from each other at their nearest point. So Mussolini comes in with his fascist troops, and within about 3 days, he pretty much conquers all of Albania. The king and the queen flee, they go to Greece, and then they go to London, and Albania basically becomes a de facto state of Italy, and they have their own fascist party. So Mussolini was there to sort of see what he could do if he could conquer Greece or Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, Germany is also present in the Balkan Peninsula, looking at Greece and Yugoslavia as well. At some point, then Germany comes in to Albania. So anyway, we have Germany's Nazi party and Italy's fascist party, both present in the Balkan Peninsula. And in 1943, then German troops occupied Albania and sort of pushed Italy out.
Isn't it weird that I think a lot of Westerners think of World War II as being like a Western European phenomenon. And then there's a lot of like work and scholarship about how, and there's a book by Timothy Snyder that's one of my favorite books called Bloodlands that's all about how, but the Holocaust was actually an Eastern European phenomenon. And I think that it's so hard for anyone to remember that any of this stuff is happening in the Balkans when, and so it's funny to me as like somebody who didn't grow up thinking about the Balkans all the time, that not only is it not just a Western European thing, it's also an Eastern European thing, but also Mussolini and Hitler are fighting over things in the Balkans while all of this other stuff is going on. Like World War II, it never ceases to amaze me like how many stories and things were happening during World War II.
It's sort of like people coming to terms with the question, well, what happens when empires disappear? So there was a huge power vacuum left by the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that a lot of the problems that happened within the Balkans were sort of reactions to the impact that the Ottoman Empire had on them. and the religious and cultural differences that the ways that different groups of people assimilated or did not assimilate with the Ottoman Empire ended up having a lot to do with tensions that would later surface in the Yugoslav wars.
Now, that's actually something we should probably mention, and just that we just haven't mentioned yet, because I think it's important, but there's not really any particular place you need to put this information. But why don't you talk a little bit about who Albanians are?
So basically, all throughout the Balkans, different groups of people reacted to Ottoman rule in different ways. Some people strictly maintained their religion, whether that was like Serbian Orthodox or the Croatians and their Catholicism. Certain groups within the Balkan Peninsula held on more tightly to Christian theology. Albanians were a little more quick to adapt and assimilate to Islam. And mostly it was out of convenience, partly because if you started to adhere to Islam, at least on the surface, you would be eligible for certain perks and bonuses. Like you could get better trading routes, or maybe you'd have less taxes, that kind of thing. So it became sort of beneficial to them to absorb some of the tenets of Islam. Anyone who's been to Albania will know that while Albania is a majority Muslim country, they do not take certain aspects of that very seriously. For example, you will be hard-pressed to find an Albanian who does not drink. And pork is very, very prevalent. So people in Albania, a lot of them do still identify as Muslims, but it is much different than I think the Western world expects Muslims to be. And also, interestingly, there's not a lot of interreligious strife within Albania. There's not a lot of, oh, you're Christian, I'm Muslim, we can't talk. In fact, it's actually incredibly religiously tolerant, and interfaith marriages are very common in Albania. So it's interesting. It has a lot of diversity within Albania.
And then another thing about Albanians that kind of helps set up where we're going with the story of the history of Albania and why it's its own weird thing. So within the Balkans, the main groups of people in the Balkans that are predominantly Muslim are Albanians and then Bosniaks. But the other thing that is different is that if you look at a Bosniak and a Croat and a Montenegrin and a Serbian, they have a lot of language that is similar. At a certain point, it's almost like these are people with different religions and not truly different ethnicities. But Albanians are truly a different ethnicity, and their language is not related to the rest of the languages in the Balkans, correct?
It's barely related to anything, actually.
And it's also ridiculously hard to pronounce.
It is. I can say 5 things in Albanian, and that's about it. And once I was at a bar in Tirana and I ordered drinks with my friend, she taught me how to say, 2 beers, please. And I swear my waiter nearly dropped his tray full of beverages just because he was so surprised.
So that, and it's not like it's extremely important when somebody's religion and language are so different. It's just that kind of helps set up why Albania goes in one direction and Yugoslavia goes in a totally different direction. So what does Albania look like at the end of World War II, and how does communist Albania get started?
So once the Soviet army helps liberate Albania, Enver Hoxha and his second in command, Mehmet Shehu, become the leaders of the country, because Enver Hoxha was the Secretary General of the Albanian Communist Party prior to the invasion. So Enver Hoxha is very into Stalinist ideology and very closely aligned with Russia, or with the Soviet Union. And so they go through a period of Stalinism, which is predictably very harsh. So the communists began to drive into exile all the elites. They try to discredit anyone in the intelligentsia They tried to liquidate wealth and just basically purge the country of its intellectuals and elites. Thousands of people were imprisoned, sent to work camps that kind of like gulags, sent to jails, and just basically very similar to what happened in Russia, in the Soviet Union during Stalin's rule.
So the relationship with Stalin starts out strong, but it doesn't continue. What happens there? Because I know that Albania, by the middle of the communist period, Albania and the USSR are not allies anymore.
Yeah, so basically, as soon as Stalin dies, the relationship with the Soviet Union becomes a little tricky, because what comes next is Khrushchev, and Khrushchev starts to sort of de-Stalinize the country a little bit. He starts to become a little more tolerant. There's less, while there's still the secret police apparatus, it is less intense. And Albania begins to think that they're not following the true communism, that Stalinism is the true communism, and that Khrushchev is taking it away from the way it should be. So they instead start to turn their eyes towards China, which completely surprised me to hear about, because you don't think of China and Albania as being natural allies. No. They're very far from one another. China is massive and has such a huge history on the world stage in our minds, and Albania is this tiny country that, while it does have a really long and important history, it's always been a big question mark for people. So Albania and China form this really strong but really strange political alliance, and China is basically subsidizing Albania massively, giving them several $1 billion in aid.
What do we know about the politics of why Albania decided to...
They started to align themselves more with the Chinese because Mao Zedong was a lot more aligned with the policies of Stalinism. And they started to believe that what the Soviet Union was doing, what Yugoslavia was doing, was not pure Stalinism, was not 100% Marxist. And so basically it was sort of Albania felt that China had more ideological purity, and that's why Albania sort of severed ties with the Soviet Union and started to be more sympathetic to China. But I do think that a lot of that was because of the tension with Yugoslavia rather than necessarily purely ideology.
So just from what I know about communism, if I had to pick a communist country to live in during the 50s or 60s, I would not have picked the Soviet Union. I would not have picked China. I probably would have picked Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia did have a pretty, not necessarily lenient, but it was more lenient than other places. What was it like to be in Albania during the 50s and 60s? And just as kind of a marker, Stalin died in 53. So this is kind of, if the country is turning towards being as pure as possible after that point, the other countries aren't, I can't imagine it was the best place to be.
Definitely not. Albania was an extreme pariah. They had very little contact with the outside world, very little access to outside information. Pretty much the only way that Albanians could hear about the outside world was to rig up radios that could intercept some transmissions from Italy. So actually, interestingly, a lot of, after English, the second most common foreign language that Albanians speak is Italian, because a lot of Albanians taught themselves Italian so that they could get information from the outside world during communism.
Oh, wow.
Basically, there's a total death grip on information. There's one of the largest secret police apparatuses imaginable. So Albania didn't have very many international partners at this point. They're pretty much starting to cut off everyone. They cut off Yugoslavia, they cut off the Soviet Union, and in the 1970s, they cut off China after Mao Zedong dies, and kind of a similar thing that happened with Stalin as Mao Zedong dies and the politics start to shift a little more to the left, Albania and Verhoeven starts to believe, oh, China's not ideologically pure enough with their communism, and so they have a rift as well. And when the Albanians and the Chinese split, that's when Albania has absolutely zero communication with other countries. North Korea now has more trade partners than Albania had during the late 1970s, which I just find insane. They were speaking to no one. It was completely insular.
That's amazing, especially considering they had Yugoslavia on one side, but they had Greece on the other side. Like, in the south, it's bordered by Greece, which wasn't a communist country at all. You would think that it would be hard to keep it that insulated. That's insane.
Right, and especially the northern part of Greece is ethnically very Albanian as well. And so you have people who are ethnically Albanian living on the outside of these boundaries, and they cannot connect with people who are who they're ethnically related to or who are part of the same ethnic group, but they're within this border. And there's absolutely no crossing of the border. Anyone who attempted to cross the border would be shot, no trial, just shot upon trying to leave. And it's estimated that several thousand people were killed just trying to cross the border. Of course, there's no documentation of this because why would there be? But it was impossible to leave Albania up until 1990, actually.
So it's a completely insular society. What was it like for people who were living there?
It's incredibly tense because the secret police are everywhere watching you. There's no import of basically anything. So people are, even in the Soviet Union, people were able to sort of get music, like they could trade Beatles records and that sort of thing. As far as I know, from the people I've spoken to, that was not happening in Albania. One of my favorite anecdotes to just illustrate the isolation of Albania during this time was in 1990 when communism fell, or in the 1990s when communism was falling, they were finding all these strange new objects in the marketplace. So they had never seen blue jeans. They had never seen bananas. Like, kids who are in their 20s had never seen blue jeans or bananas, and they were like these strange new imports. So Albania was really isolated from the global market in a way that other communist countries were not.
Yeah, so the closer you were to the West, the more of a black market could exist. So, like, Hungary had more of a black market than, like, Bulgaria because Hungary was so close to Western countries. It was just logistically easier. And then also those governments were more concerned about uprisings, so they let things be a little bit easier. And then the further east you go, typically it is harder. But Albania is a situation that is just completely, because it is completely isolated and it's bordered on one side by water and on one side by another communist country that is also not completely isolated, but more not a part of the Stalinist network as much. There's just no way for things to get in. That's crazy. Like,
yeah. And I should note also, this is very important. So previously we were talking about how Albania was always a very religiously diverse country and that there was not a lot of interreligious strife. But in 1967, Enver Hoxha actually banned religion in Albania, and his government enacted a violent campaign to shut down churches and mosques. So a lot of really old and really beautiful churches and mosques were destroyed, unfortunately, and they are still in the process of rebuilding a lot of the churches and mosques. I went to a church in Korcha that looked as if it was, 200 years old, one of those old Orthodox style cathedrals. And sure enough, it was built in the 90s. So there were a couple buildings that were preserved because they said that they were culturally significant. And one of the mosques was actually turned, I think, into a party headquarters or the party capital of culture or party cultural center. So it was preserved, but with the exception of that, most mosques and churches were destroyed during this time.
Now, what does the 80s look like? Because if communism ends in 1990, what does it look like as it's starting to fall?
So in the 1980s, keep in mind that this whole time, Albania has been under one dictator, Enver Hoxha. And in the 1980s, his health is starting to decline, and he knows that his time is nearly up. So the question of how is he going to transition his power comes up. And he had some sort of split with his second-hand man, Mehmet Shehu, and he starts to sort of freeze him out. And so when Hoxha goes into sort of quasi-retirement in 1983, he puts someone else in charge, Ramiz Alia. And Ramiz Alia basically started acting as the de facto leader of Albania as Hoxha couldn't continue his role.
Why does he start to have to step aside? Is it just that he's close to retirement?
Basically, his health started to decline in the early 1980s, and by 1983, he's starting to see the end in sight. And he didn't want Shehu to continue on. I don't know exactly what the split was, but he actually started to purge members of Shehu's family and his supporters as well. And he started to maneuver behind the scenes to make sure that his new number one man, Ramiz Alia, would be the one to assume responsibility for Albania. In 1985, Hoxha died, but because he had worked behind the scenes to make sure that Ramiz Alia would take over for him, communism was still able to hold on. But Ramiz Alia was not so crazy as Enver Hoxha.
When you say Enver Hoxha was crazy, let's talk a little bit about Enver Hoxha's particularly weird brand of paranoia, because it's not just that Albania was completely isolated. It's that Albanians were almost put under like a terror that the outside world was going to get them.
So Enver Hoxha was perhaps one of the most paranoid leaders in the history of the world. And as a result, Albania has a very unique architectural feature, you could say. Hundreds of thousands of concrete bunkers. So Enver Hoxha truly believed that Albania was under imminent threat of an attack, and he began building bunkers everywhere from within the cities to the countryside, even on beaches. He began building concrete bunkers, and I think there are almost 200,000 bunkers built into the Albanian countryside.
And they're like legitimately everywhere. Like I took, first of all, buses in Albania are not my favorite buses. But when you're on a bus in Albania and you drive through the country, you will see these everywhere, like on people's private property, which obviously wasn't private property during communism.
Yeah. There's an average of 5 bunkers for every square kilometer in Albania. That's madness.
Yeah, that's insane. And these bunkers were designed for people to go inside and hide.
Yeah. So the thought was that if someone came for them, that the Albanians would all retreat to their bunkers with machine guns in hand to fight off the invaders. That was actually what people believed. Or that was actually what Hoxha built them for, so that people could enter these bunkers, hide from invaders, and fight them off.
So, is there anything else that is particularly interesting to you about Hoxha before we kill him off?
Well, I got to tour his bunker in Albania, actually. So if you go to Tirana, the bunkers we've been talking about look like mini UFOs. They can fit maybe 4, 5, 6 people if you get real cozy. Enver Hoxha, of course, because he was Queen Bee, if you will, had a massive multi-story bunker just a couple kilometers outside the main center city of Tirana. and you can tour it now. It's now a museum, and it's just massive.
I need to go back and see Tirana. I had a really weird afternoon where I was just trying to catch a bus that nobody could tell me where it left from.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That's kind of what it's like to travel Albania, but in a really cool way.
Yeah. No, Albania has like no official bus stations, no national bus lines. So in order to figure out where you got to go, it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. But I actually found that to be part of the fun of traveling there, I have to admit. Oh, and one other thing, one fun fact I'd like to share is, so Enver Hoxha's old party house in the center of Tirana is now across the street from the very first international chain food restaurant in all of Albania, which happens to be KFC. Oh. I just find that really funny that, like, the emblem of American capitalism is directly across the street from his former residence.
I love that.
And also the former Communist Party. So basically in Tirana there used to be a neighborhood that was entirely reserved for like Communist Party loyalists. And now that is the hipster neighborhood of Tirana. And like if you want to go out at night, you go to Bloku, which means block. And that's like where all the cool young Albanians are hanging out, but it used to be basically a closed city for only like party loyalists.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I got to go back to Tirana and spend some time there.
Yeah, I'll be there this summer.
All right, so Hoxha's sick. Which number 2 ended up being the one that took over?
Shehu died in 1981 under mysterious circumstances, but everyone is pretty certain that he was actually murdered by Hoxha. He installs Ramiz Aliyah as his replacement. So Hoxha dies in 1985, and Ramiz Aliyah takes over, and the country starts to liberalize a little bit. They start to open up a bit of freedom of speech, and slowly but surely they even allow the freedom to travel abroad in 1990. With the ability to travel abroad, that means information sort of starts seeping back across borders. So that's when you start to see mass protests happening in Albania. So first, you see the first protests happened in Shkodra, which is very far north, kind of on the border with Montenegro, or close to the border with Montenegro. So protests began in Shkodra, and they take down a Stalinist statue and are basically agitating for an end to communism. Even though it has started to lighten up and it's becoming a little closer to Yugoslavia than their previous isolation, people still aren't happy. And so Aliyah has his finger sort of on the pulse of what's going on. He knows that people are unhappy. He knows that his situation is untenable because keep in mind around this time, the Romanian Revolution is happening and Ceausescu was executed. So I think at this point in the 1990s, as communist government after communist government is falling, any leader of a communist country would be stupid to not be scared. Mm-hmm. So Aliyah's doing what he can to sort of relax the Stalinism and change it to more of a Yugoslav-style communism. But it's not really working. And then in December of 1990, there are massive student protests in the capital. And he hears this and sort of is reading the sign of the times. And on the 11th of December, that's when you can sort of say that communism, it's hard to find an exact end date to when communism ended in Albania, because you could say that it ended in 1990 because on December 11th, he started to allow political pluralism. So an opposition party is allowed to form. So at the end of 1990, you now have two parties existing in Albania with freedom of speech, but the communists are still technically in power. In the 1991 election, they maintained their hold on power.
It's weird for us as like people who grew up in a democratic republic to think of like a communist party like being a party that's standing for elections. But that happened in a few communist countries that fell. Like I'm even thinking of like Cambodia right now has like a communist party in chart. Like it doesn't, it's it's cognizant dissonance to us just because we grew up in such a different system. But even after communism fell, the Communist Party was still a political party and they ran in elections. It's just the elections weren't rigged.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, having political parties and having communism, but let's just say election integrity is not super high often in those instances. So anyway, by 1992, that's when the communists are officially voted out of power and the Democratic Party takes place. And so 1992 or 1990, you could kind of say that either one. 1990 is the beginning of the end of communism, and then in 1992, that's when you have sort of the official end of communism in Albania.
So Albania is still a really struggling country economically.
Yeah.
It's not... Different countries after the fall of communism had different economic paths and different challenges, but it seems like Albania has had a harder path than most, although they have been spared some of the violence. But what was post-communism like?
Post-communism in Albania was definitely a lot more difficult than other countries. Like countries like the Czech Republic and Slovakia made the transition from communism to democracy pretty well, and they're now very economically stable countries. Albania was not so lucky. So basically, because Albania went from such complete and total isolation, we're talking zero trade partners at one point. The economy was basically like starting at zero. So there were not a lot of systems in place to protect Albanians. So what happened was there was a lot of economic instability and lack of regulations, lack of protections. And so certain unscrupulous individuals were basically running Ponzi schemes, like get-rich-quick ideas. And this was happening for the first 5 or 7 years of Albania's existence as an independent, non-communist country. And then in 1997, everything went to hell, and there were mass riots because people basically lost their entire life savings due to these pyramid schemes. And the corruption in the government did not protect them from these pyramid schemes, so Albanians just lost everything. And so there were riots, and hundreds of thousands of people lost everything they owned, and I think eventually Italy had to step in and sort of like, a couple different countries had to step in and keep the peace.
So how do they get from that to where they are now? Like what do they recover? What does recovery look like?
So they've recovered from the economic instability of that time with the pyramid schemes and anarchy that was happening in the 1996, 1997. That eventually calms down. People don't get their money back, but they learn to move on. So basically seems like almost the entire country was the victims of like a Bernie Madoff style scheme.
And it's not like they had a lot to lose to begin with. So that would be devastating.
But you'd be surprised. Albanians lost a total of $1.2 billion spread out between a couple 100,000 people.
Oh my God.
Like, that's a massive amount of money. And so that's what really sent the country into chaos. And keep in mind, like, they only had 5 or 6 years of a free market to even get that money. And then they just lose it all again.
That's insane.
But I guess the thing is that they had been through worse, right? Like, they had gotten through 30, 40 years of Enver Hoxha's reign. So they just had to start over again. And now Albania is on the way. It's on the way up. They are now members of NATO. They are trying to become members of the European Union. They've received a lot of assistance from the European Union. I saw a lot of projects working on the development of clean water systems, development of roads funded by the EU. So Albania has been helped quite a bit by the European Union, and it has helped to stabilize the economy and to increase the quality of life in Albania. Obviously, problems don't disappear. There are still a lot of problems with corruption. And at the moment, I know there are a lot of problems with developers sort of wanting to destroy some of the natural wonders of Albania. They're talking about turning one of the most beautiful lakes in Albania into just some sort of hydropower plant. This stuff is happening all over the world, but it's extra easy for it to happen in Albania, I think, because the government is still not super strong.
So obviously we're talking about Albania not because it's this economically devastated place, but because we've both been there recently, and despite the problems it's had in the past, it is a really wonderful place to visit. And
oh my God, yes.
And not only that, it's kind of like the Middle East or North Africa, where not only is it a wonderful place to visit, but when you visit and you spend money there, it actually does a lot of good for the local economy to have foreign money coming in the form of tourism. So let's talk about some of the, what were your favorite things that you did while you were there that people should definitely go to if they are there?
So my favorite part of Albania would probably be the coastline. They have one of the most beautiful coastlines in all of Europe. It's called the Albanian Riviera, and it is just stunning. They have some of the most beautiful blue turquoise waters you could ever see. The water is so warm and salty and really fun to swim and float in. The beaches are not very crowded, unlike Croatia and Montenegro. It's the same coast, the same water, but you will pay a third of what you will in Croatia. So for a budget-conscious traveler, Albania is a really great destination. So the beaches are really lovely. The mountains are also beautiful. There are some mountain towns called Valbona and Theth that you can do a hike from one to the other. That's a really popular option for tourists. And there's a lot of good tourist infrastructure there, like nice guest house and good signposting to do the hike. The city of Shkodra is really beautiful and probably the most Western or European feeling city, which sounds weird to say because, of course, it's European. It's in Europe. But a lot of Albania doesn't feel particularly European. So Shkodra is definitely the most European feeling of all the cities in Albania. Everyone's riding on bicycles. There are beautiful buildings and people are always out having a coffee in the main square. Lots of really nice museums, a good photography museum, and really close to a beautiful lake. So Shkodra is also really wonderful. We talked earlier about Berat and Gjirokastra, which are two UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And they have really unique Ottoman era architecture. Gjirokastra is called the Stone City because the whole city is made out of stone tiles, which are really beautiful. And I've never seen anything like that. And then Berat is called the City of a Thousand Eyes. It's really distinctive windows and white painted walls all built onto a hill across a river. It's one of the most beautiful places I've been. And I should also mention Butrint, the really beautiful Butrint, the really interesting Roman ruins that there are virtually no people at. It's so rare that you can go to Roman ruins and see no one there. But that's what happens when you go to Butrint.
One of the things I like about Butrint, too, is the city is laid out in a way where you can see. It's not in the middle of, so a lot of ruins are in the middle of current cities, but Butrint is not a city that people live in now. If you go there, you stay in Saranda or Kasamil or one of the modern towns, but Butrint is not there. It's not like you're competing against other places. So you're walking around this Roman city, but there's no modern buildings in between. You feel like you're almost in a nature park. It's really cool.
Yeah. It's really beautiful. It's set on this lake with these mountains. It was one of the first places I went to in Albania because I took the ferry from Greece. So Greece is also really close to Albania. I took a ferry from Corfu to Saranda, and it took 1 hour to get there from Corfu to Saranda, and that was on the slow ferry. So I think we often forget just how close Albania is to other super popular tourist destinations like Croatia, Italy, and Greece. And it's hard, some people don't realize that you have the same topography, the same coastline, and you can have just a really interesting cultural experience that is totally different than any of your standard vacation spots. You're really helping out a developing economy that is insanely welcoming towards tourists. This is the thing I should have led with this. Albanians are some of the nicest people I've met in the entire world. They are so friendly. They will, as soon as they find out that you're a foreigner, they are delighted. If they have any English, they will talk your ear off. If they don't have any English, they will buy you a coffee and just smile at you. Like, there's nothing that makes an Albanian happier than hearing someone say that they are visiting their country and that they enjoy it. And I also didn't talk about Tirana. Tirana is, I think that of all the places people visit in Albania, Tirana is probably the most common because people will kind of pop through Tirana on their way while they're doing a tour of the Balkans. But Tirana is a difficult city to love because it's a little ugly, it's a little rough around the edges. It doesn't have, I don't know how to describe Tirana.
My experience in Tirana was being dropped off at one bus station, having 1,000 people try to give me a taxi ride, but nobody speaking enough English to tell me where the other taxi station was, or other bus station was, to get on my bus to go north. And so I literally spent 2 hours walking around in circles.
That sounds, yeah. Well, there isn't even a direct bus, right? Like, didn't you would have had to go to Shkodra and then to Ulcin or something, or did you
So I went to Shkodër and then I hired a taxi in Shkodër to drive me to Kotor.
Okay, yeah. They have a really interesting concept. There's a really great article. So we'll link it in the show notes. There's a really great article about the concept of Besa, which is, Besa can be translated as faith or trust, but it's really hard to translate, and it's very important to Albanians. But basically, it's a code that means it's their duty to look after their guests, and it's a dishonor to let any harm befall your guest. And so that's why when you're traveling around in Albania, you'll find such hospitality, such kindness, because it's been passed down from generation to generation, this belief in Besa.
So if somebody was going to go to Albania, and they should definitely go to the coast, and they should definitely go to the south, do you think that they should go to Tirana?
Absolutely. I think Tirana is an incredibly interesting and incredibly vibrant city. It's really where the heart of young Albania is located and where Albanians are sort of reinventing themselves. I would say, though, that I would not only go to Tirana, because if you just want to check Albania off of your list and you just want to go to one place in Albania and make that Tirana, you're not really getting, number one, the most accurate idea of Albania, because Tirana is just massive, it's crowded, it's hectic. But the Albanian countryside is really beautiful, and small towns are where you'll really get to know people on an individual level. So I think it's really important, yes, go to Tirana, but also go to some of the smaller towns, some of the smaller cities, and balance your time like that as well. And also, Tirana I loved it, but I think other people might find it chaotic and stressful. So if you only go to Tirana, you might leave with the idea in your head that all of Albania is like hectic and chaotic, and that's not really the case. Tirana is wonderful, but go to other places as well.
And is there anything else that people should know before going to Albania?
There's really no place like it in the world, so whatever you expect, you will be proven wrong.
I agree. So even going around the Balkans, first of all, every Balkan country has its own flavor.
Yeah, its own quirks.
It's not like you can be, if you're really, it's from far away, it's easy to say it's like a mono culture, a monolith. And then you get there and you're like, oh, no.
Not at all.
But within that, Albania is its own special thing, and more people should visit it. And it's nice when you visit somewhere and you know that it's doing good and that people really want you there.
Yeah, and I also want to say that people in Albania hate the movie Taken because they feel like it ruined their image. So don't mention Liam Neeson, don't mention Taken, because I had several people be like, "We're not like Taken." They really take that movie personally. And so, but I can tell you, I hitchhiked through Albania and lived to tell the tale, and actually it was some of the best things. It was some of the best days I had were the days I was hitchhiking through Albania. Albania is super, super safe. You're at no more risk of crime than virtually anywhere else in Europe. And in fact, I once changed my money at a money changing place and had the man find me at the bus station. He ran 3 blocks to find me because he was afraid that he gave me the wrong change. He ended up he gave me the right change, but he wasn't sure. He just I think he just spaced out for a second. He literally ran down to find me to make sure that he had given us the right change. So people there really are not trying to take advantage. People generally, obviously you can find a bad egg anywhere, but I found that no one took care of me when I was traveling solo quite like Albanians did, which is why I think I feel really loyal to the country and really, I really want to be its ambassador and tell people to go to Albania, because it really just made me fall in love with travel all over again. So please go.
Now, where can people find you if they want to read more about your Balkan or other adventures?
You can find me at eternalarival.com. And I think the best resource that I can give you is I have a massive post called 75 Reasons to Visit Albania ASAP, which to date is probably my most popular piece I've ever published on my blog. And I still have Albanians commenting at least once a week being "Thank you for writing about our country. This is really accurate." So if a bunch of Albanians think it's accurate and are really jazzed about it, I think I managed to maybe do something right. So you can check it out if you're interested in knowing more of the reasons why you should visit this beautiful country.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. And
No
you'll have to come on some other time and we'll pick someplace else to talk about down the road.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you again to Allison for coming on the show. If you enjoy listening to this crazy history of Albania and it makes you want to go there, which I hope it does, you should definitely check out her website. She has lots of amazing travel tips for Albania and the rest of the Balkans, and then actually lots of countries too, because Allison, like me, has this problem where we kind of want to go everywhere and see just the entire world. So you should definitely check it out. As far as housekeeping goes, so I am recording this episode in Hanoi, but it's going to drop on Monday, and I leave this weekend for Malaysia. So this episode will drop when I am in Kuala Lumpur, and that is the last leg of my Asia trip. So if you want to see live videos, pictures, and updates in real time from Malaysia, check out my Facebook page or my Instagram. They are both under @HistoryFangirl. And if you haven't left a review of the show yet on the podcast app of your choice, it would be really wonderful if you could go in and write a review. It helps tremendously with helping new people find the show, and it also always brightens my day when I see a new great review. It doesn't brighten my day the one time I saw a bad review, so if you want to leave a bad review, you can, but I don't know why you'd want to do that. So I would love it if you would go and leave a review, though. It's completely up to you what you write. Thank you so much for listening.